Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this special live audience recording of Left of Black here at the John Hope Franklin Center for Interdisciplinary and International Studies. Periodically, we will do an event here with a live audience when we have special guests who are visiting us here at Duke. And today, that is Margot Lee Shetterly, who is the author of a new book that just came out recently about the Black women computers and mathematicians at NASA, soon to be a Hollywood film that will be released in January. Thank you for joining us here today, Margot.
Mark, thank you so much for having me on the program.
Talk a little bit about where you grew up, Hampton, Virginia. There's a moment in the book where you talk about it at 18 years old. You know, you were just thinking that Hampton would be the spot that you would be able to launch your life from. But here you are with Hidden Figures, and it's all back to this area where you grew up. Talk a little bit about what Hampton, Virginia was like when you were growing up.
So if I had to describe Hampton, Virginia growing up, it would probably be middle America. It was a place, although it was very particular because it was a place that was and still is part of what we call the military-industrial complex. There are, Army bases, Navy bases, shipyards, Air Force Base, and there is NASA. And in fact, the Langley Research Center, as it's now called, is the original installation of what would become, over the years, NASA. It was founded just as basically as a consequence of World War I. And so over the course of the 20th century, through the 1920s and 30s, and then in the 40s, those people working there dedicated themselves to airplane research. Eventually, they did the work that would send the first Americans into space and to the moon. So all of this happened in my backyard, in my hometown. A number of the people that I knew, including my father, who is a now retired research scientist, worked at NASA Langley. So I grew up among a lot of people who were technical people, engineers, scientists, mathematicians. Many of them were Black, like my father, and many of them were women, and a number of them were Black women who were doing this work. So it was an unusual, in retrospect, kind of a...
Did you think much at all about some of the work that these folks were doing as you were growing up? These are, Black middle class, upper working class folks who are working in the sciences, who are mathematicians, physicists. As a kid, are you thinking much about who these folks are and the kind of work that they're doing?
Not in the big picture. I think they were like my parents or my parents' friends. It was like NASA was cool. It was still, not that far when I was growing up from the moon landing. And it was like, oh, that's cool. My dad works at NASA. He's smart. There were these things that I thought, but it wasn't like I thought it was, or thought to look beyond the context or look to the history, really, of that center and how it came to be.
At what point do you start to put together the pieces to the puzzle and realize that there's a story there that needs to be told? I was curious, in the book you describe yourself as, a first-time author.
Yes.
Right? You don't have a background as a historian, but yet you realize this story is there. Talk about how you came to that come to Jesus moment, if you will, where you just knew you had to tell this story.
Yeah, well, I tell you, it's a very specific moment. My husband Aaron is here in the audience today, and 6 years ago we had gone to visit my parents for Christmas, and driving around with my dad in his minivan, and there was one Sunday we'd gone to church and we saw a former Sunday school teacher who happened to have been a mathematician there at Langley. And it was sort of, it was one of these things where I kind of know these stories. My dad started talking about it and these women and the work that they had done. And it was my husband who said, wait a minute, you're telling me there's this group of women and Black women, and they were calculating launch windows for the astronauts in the 1960s, and my dad, was like, yeah, he'd worked with them and known them. And, for me, it was a moment of seeing the place that I had grown up with and the work that my father had done and the shoulders that he had stood on, these women, with fresh eyes. And, saying to myself, well, how did they get here? Like, where did this begin? And that was the beginning of what eventually became Hidden Figures.
And this is an interesting moment right in history because you have college-educated black folks, black folks with book knowledge.
Yeah.
And, there aren't a whole lot of places for them to be able to articulate that book knowledge, right? You have a lot of examples of folks with PhDs, that are like gym teachers and even janitors and things like that. So Langley seems to offer an opportunity for some of these folks that they might not have expected.
They didn't. So when these women, the first black women, walked through those doors at Langley in 1943.
Wow.
And they were math teachers. They were good at math. They were women. They were black women. So what were they going to do? They were teachers.
Yeah.
They were teaching in public schools
Segregated
public schools across the country. And so when this door opened, it was an opportunity that they hadn't even imagined existed. So it really was, it was really a moment. And it was not even a full decade after the first white women had started working in the computing pool. So this idea of professional math as a career path for women was very new at that time.
Tell us a little bit about some of these women.
Well, the woman who is probably most well known at this point is a woman named Katherine Johnson. She's 98 years old. She turned 98 years old a couple of months ago. Still very much in command of her story, which is remarkable. So Katherine Johnson was born in 1918 in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. She worked many years as a teacher. She actually was among the first 3 black students to integrate West Virginia University's graduate school back in the early 1930s. But she, by the 1950s, had found her way to Hampton, Virginia, was working as a mathematician on airplanes. That's what they were doing at the time. And then in 1957, when the Russians launched the Sputnik satellite, and then what had then been the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics became NASA,
Right,
the space agency, the space race.
Yeah.
She was working in a group that was very closely associated with the space race, and that then became her job, calculating trajectories for the Project Mercury missions and Project Apollo. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom a year ago, this month, a year ago, November 2015, for the work that she did in advancing our country's cause and advantage in the space race.
Was NASA at all conflicted by having these women do the work? And not just the black women in this instance. I mean, you make the point in the book that really the stories of the white women who were at Langley, those stories haven't been told either. And if you think about some of these women coming to work there, 1943, and of course there's this whole moment of women integrating the workforce at that period of time because of the war.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how is NASA at all conflicted by the presence of women doing this kind of work and conflicted about how it can acknowledge their labor in the context of this larger goal to get to the moon?
Right. Well, I think, the conflict in the beginning was that there were these memos that are like, the men really resisted this idea of having these women, how could the women do this work? It's math. But the women were good at it. Mm-hmm. The women significantly improved the efficiency and the effectiveness and the reach of the aeronautical research process. So when something works, you're going to go with it. And additionally, they were paid less money than the men, right? This was like good for the bottom line as well. It was like win in every circumstance. So that was really the original conflict. And then, they started working there in greater numbers. But I think they worked in the context, obviously, of the time. They were paid less than the men. The expectations were not that the women would come in and want to be engineers and move up. The expectation was that they would be glad to get paid more, and they were getting paid like 3 times more than they were making as teachers. And then maybe they'd get married, or maybe they'd just be content with the work. So it was only over time that, as the expectations of society changed and the expectations of the women changed, that they really forced NASA to change as well.
You talk about when you thought about the phrase black women mathematicians at NASA, that it was a kind of cognitive dissonance that you experienced. What was it like when you realized that you have this story that needs to be told, and you're looking for publishers to tell this story? I mean, what are their reactions when you tell them that this is a story about black women mathematicians at NASA? I mean, is it believable to them? Are they shocked? Are they excited? I mean, what's that experience like?
Honestly, the response to this story from the very beginning has been so positive and so strong. And I think that every story has its time. Mm-hmm. These women worked for many, many decades, and nobody really saw them as what they're doing. And I think for any number of reasons, this time now, people are embracing this. And so I feel really fortunate. Part of it is, I think, Katherine Johnson, to be 98 years old, to have lived so long, and to be able to still tell her own story, and to hear her story firsthand has certainly helped people get interested in this.
How has she felt about this new attention towards her life and her career? I mean, I'm imagining, if you go back, say, 30 years ago, in the 70s, I mean, are these women wondering if anyone's ever really going to know their story, right? And if you're Katherine Johnson, what does it mean now for this story to be represented in the way that it's going to be represented?
I don't think that they had that question of, is someone going to tell my story? That wasn't a question. When you ask them, well, what was it like to do this work? Did you feel like a pioneer? All of these things. They say, I was doing my job. I did my job really well. But there wasn't this idea, or I think the expectation, that somebody should tell the story of what we're doing now. I think it's only with the distance and with history that they and we kind of see of what they are doing and what they have done. But they still, Katherine Johnson and the other women still remain very modest about these accomplishments, even as I think they are grateful now to be acknowledged in this way for the work that they're doing.
The work that you've done with the book has now led to other work, and you're running something called the Human Computer Project. Can you talk a little bit about that? Yeah,
so, the first interview of this which became this whole book, was with this woman, Kathleen Land, who was the Sunday school teacher. Then, Katherine Johnson, and then Katherine Johnson told me, Dorothy Vaughan is the smartest person I've ever met. Which means, you pay attention when she says that. So at each step, there were just more names and more people, and Dorothy Vaughan's daughter told me about 5 other people. And, so there was this huge number of women, black women, and then this larger group of all women accumulating. And it was sort of shocking that they had done this work for decades and nobody really looked at them in this way. So there's no way to make a coherent book that is about a lot of people. You have to make decisions of okay, who is going to carry the story? But I really felt that it was important to try and honor all of the women and the work they had done, because none of them had really been acknowledged. And then the other thing was, as we're asking these questions about inclusivity in STEM, why are there not more women mathematicians? Why are there not more underrepresented minorities in STEM fields? This is a data set that hopefully will teach us some of those things. Women who spent their entire careers at the space agency, and who we know what they did, we have their research papers, we know where they went to school, we know their race. There are all these things that I feel if we really dig and get as much of the information about them as possible, I think it's a really valuable resource as we try to make policy decisions.
I mean, we can remember 20 years ago, you have talking Barbies that say things like, I hate math, right? And so there's almost a social belief that women aren't interested right, and the sciences and mathematicians. You know, my dean here, Valerie Ashby, is a chemist. So clearly that's not the case. What kind of impact do you see this work, the book, and of course now the film having on young women? And by young women, I'm thinking about 12, 13, 14 years old and their ideas about pursuing careers in STEM fields.
Yeah, you know, honestly, it's been wonderful, overwhelming. I mean, I got a tweet this is like a month ago from the mother of a girl who I think was maybe like 7 or 8 years old, who had drawn a picture, and she'd written on the picture, "Dear Katherine Johnson and Christine Darden, I think you are so smart. I am so impressed by what you've done, and I want to be like you." You know, so it was amazing, you know, to get that and to, you know, pass that on to these women. And even for women who are older, who are in high school or college age, you know, I'm working now with a number of groups that are mathematicians, female mathematicians, who are really trying to push to get greater representation in mathematics. And in January in Atlanta, at the Joint Math Meetings, which is the global convocation of mathematicians. So 6,000 mathematicians from around the world are converging on Atlanta. We are going to be honoring the work of the women of Hidden Figures.
That's incredible to hear. In January, also, the film Hidden Figures comes out. Academy Award winner Octavia Spencer plays Katherine Johnson. Are you surprised that the story was so compelling? That, you know, someone thought that this would make a great film.
Yeah, and actually, so they have actually moved the date up of the film. It will be opening in 15 cities around the country, including Hampton and Norfolk, which I am so excited about, on Christmas Day.
Wow.
Yeah, and then January 6th, it will be opening across the country. So the thing that's really wonderful is that the woman who is the producer on the film, she got a hold of the book proposal, and she is one of the few powerful women in Hollywood. Her name is Donna Gelati. She produced Silver Linings Playbook. She produced Shakespeare in Love. She was captivated by the story of these women and what they went through, and the fact that they were protagonists. Yeah. You know, they were protagonists of their own story, and so she became a champion for this, and has really, the fact that this is happening on this time frame has everything to do with her desire to really drive this through the normally slow and difficult and Byzantine process of getting a movie made.
You go back and you think about your life 10 years ago. Could you imagine any of this?
No. No, but, you know, I have to say one of the things that has been wonderful for me writing this book and getting to know these women is a lot of these women did not come to the work that they would make their lives and, you know, that we're looking at now and honoring until they were in their 30s, they were married, they had children, you know, they had already spent a number of years working as teachers, and they had no idea what was in store for them. So as somebody who is writing about people who's going through the same thing that happened to the women that I'm writing about, it's a real lesson that you just don't know where life will take you, and you have to stay open.
What's next for you, Margot?
You know, there's a lot still to do with Hidden Figures and the Human Computer Project. I mean, you know, I think while this moment of opportunity is here, you know, I want to make sure that if there is a way to really make some lasting change in terms of women in STEM and you know, underrepresented minorities in STEM, that we do that. But I, you know, over the course of the research of this book, I found 2 more stories, interesting characters, African-American mid-century stories, kind of big narratives, with a lot of these themes of the American dream and mobility. So, you know, I have my work cut out for me for the next couple of books.
We've been joined this afternoon by Margot Lee Shetterly, who has talked to us about her new book, Hidden Figures, soon to be a Hollywood film in January. Thank you for joining us, Margot.
Thank you. This was a pleasure.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.